now we're going to be getting into the Advanced Air Mobility Short Course. And for that, I will welcome Yolanka, Wulff, Adam, Cohen, and Clint Harper up on the stage. These are national experts in the topic of advanced air mobility planning. And they are, I think they're getting an increasingly well-honed body of work in presenting this material to communities around the country. We were having dinner last night, and I asked Yolanka how many communities they had engaged in the 5 years or so they have been an organization much like DART, and I think it's closing in on 100, if I'm not mistaken. So this is intended to be useful for community planners as well as community entities who may be wondering what this whole idea is, and they'll walk us through considerations for communities thinking about air mobility as part of their transportation system. We'll conclude at 11:30 and then have lunch and then welcome Senator Caballero. So with that, I will switch to the PowerPoint as it says here and welcome Yolanka, Adam, and Clint up on the stage. Okay. Yeah, and I will say, obviously we're a small group. Let's keep it informal, not too informal. It seems like there'll be opportunities for questions along the way, and stay human out there because we need it in the world right now, especially. So, Yolanka.
Josh, thank you. Good morning, everyone. And I'm going to spare my co-presenters, Clint and Adam, and tell them they don't have to sit on the stage the whole time. This is 2 hours long. So we will switch back and forth. Thank you for being here. My name is Yolanka Wulff. I'm Executive Director of CAMI, the Community Air Mobility Initiative. I'm going to tell you a little bit about CAMI. So we are a 501c3 educational nonprofit. We're about 4.5 years old, and we formed, my co-founder, Anna Dietrich, and I created CAMI because we saw in this growing technology arena of advanced air mobility that nobody was talking to the states, the cities, the communities, the planners, the regions, the tribes, about this new form of mobility that was being developed. And that was a big vacuum. So the mission of CAMI is to support the sustainable and responsible integration of advanced air mobility into transportation systems. We do that through education, communication, and collaboration. Towards the end, I will come back and tell you a little bit more about some of the resources we've developed and the programs we have for those agencies, airports, and planners. But that is our mission, and we're really pleased to be able to be here for the second year in a row at the DART Symposium presenting. And I want to thank Josh and the DART team for having us here. So as an organization, one of the things we do, as I said, is develop resources. And one of those resources is what we call our AAM 101 short course. We've done this course in anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. Today we have a 2-hour version. And our goal here is to give you an entry-level understanding of advanced air mobility. But it's an understanding that is not a technical one alone. A lot of what you will hear if you go to advanced air mobility conferences is a lot about the aircraft, a lot about the propulsion systems. We're looking at this much more broadly from a community integration piece, from a planning piece. So you're going to hear a mix today of information that spans that spectrum. So as Josh mentioned, I have two of our expert contributors with me today who are going to present on different topics. Adam Cohen, who's a senior research manager from the Transportation Sustainability Research Center at UC Berkeley, and Clint Harper, who's an advanced air mobility advocate at Harper 4D Solutions. Personally, 2 words about my background. By education and profession, I'm an attorney. I no longer practice, but when I did, I worked a lot in land use and in organizational entity formation and management of nonprofits and small businesses. I've worked primarily as a consultant, and for the last almost 15 years as a sustainable aviation consultant. I also have a background in sustainable transportation. So I come at this very much from a sustainable transportation perspective. All right, so what are we going to cover today? We're going to do, turn off my watch. An introduction to advanced air mobility. What is advanced air mobility? And I'll do that. Then I'm going to turn it over to Clint to talk about aircraft and airspace and advanced air mobility infrastructure. We'll pause there for a Q&A, and then we'll move on. Adam will come up and talk about a planning and policy framework and state and local planning for advanced air mobility. Then I will come back and talk about community engagement and some of those CAMI resources. So let's start with Introduction to Advanced Air Mobility. What is advanced air mobility? So advanced air mobility often is conflated with the aircraft that are being developed. When you ask people what's advanced air mobility, you may say, oh, well, that's eVTOLs, electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. Advanced air mobility is not an aircraft, it's a concept. And it's a broad concept that looks at these new technologies, these emerging aviation markets and use cases for urban, suburban, and rural operations. So it includes local use cases of around 50 miles in rural or urban areas, as well as interregional use cases up to a few hundred miles. So the objective of advanced air mobility is to move people and cargo through the air between places more effectively and efficiently, especially in currently underserved local, regional, urban, and rural environments. So what kind of use cases are we talking about? Well, broadly, we've got some categories that we look at: passenger mobility, logistics and goods delivery, emergency response and other humanitarian operations, and then some commercial applications. So what we expect at maturity is that advanced air mobility will enable customers to access air mobility, goods delivery, and emergency services through an integrated and connected multimodal transportation system. You're going to hear more about multimodality a little later when Adam talks. This is key to understanding advanced air mobility. Until now, aviation as a form of transportation has operated separately from other forms of transportation. So we're all familiar with the intersection of different modes of ground transportation, or even ground and marine. I live in the Pacific Northwest on an island west of Seattle, and our ferry system, our local transit buses coordinate their pickup and delivery with the times that the ferries come and go. You've seen multimodal hubs where you have light rail, and you'll have Ubers and Lyfts there that coordinate with the arrival of trains. You'll have active transportation like bicycles and scooters. Those are all developments that incorporate the idea of multimodality. Aviation to date has not been part of that. And for advanced air mobility as a concept to work, we need to fold those together. And so that's more complicated than just making the aircraft fly. So I'm going to talk about a couple of these use cases a little bit more. So first of all, emergency services. So now we're talking about anything from disaster response, aeromedical, firefighting, law enforcement, any of those uses where you can imagine that having these vehicles being available to move people, to move organs, lab samples, all of these are great use cases with a lot of public benefit. The next one is the concept of an air taxi. So this is on-demand, point-to-point passenger transportation. So it basically works like app-based transportation network companies, TNCs like Uber and Lyft. Another concept for moving passengers is air metro. This is akin to a bus route. So these are flights that travel regularly through the day. They're not scheduled at a particular time, but they may have a route, and you would call them up or make a reservation, and these routes are one way that we could address challenges like transportation deserts, places that, because of the geography or the topography, are very hard to get to or get out of via ground transportation. And finally, microhaul airline operations. We see that already today. This diagram is a map of Cape Air out of Boston and Cape Cod. So you can imagine if we can electrify fixed-wing aircraft and fly them on microhaul operations, that we would be able to move people much more efficiently. And I know Kenji and Alex from Oregon Department of Aviation are here, and we've been having conversations about the possibilities of routes between some of the Oregon airports and Washington airports through an electrified aviation system. One of the other great benefits of microhaul is that it allows us to use some of the 5,000 public access general aviation airports that we have in this country that are currently not being used or underused. So we already have some infrastructure there. You'll hear more on infrastructure from Clint coming up next. So is this happening? Yes. When is it happening? With a lot of the aviation regulatory agencies, you will hear the terms crawl, walk, run. At CAMI, we like to use emerging, growing, and maturing to think about how this agency or this new form of mobility is unfolding. So emerging would be in the first 5 years. That is now. So this is really testing, demonstration projects, developing certification, developing some initial infrastructure to be able to do some low volume operations. From 5 to 10 years out, we see this as the growing stage, where we expand markets, expand vertiport infrastructure, some of the new infrastructure rather than using existing infrastructure, and really building towards commercially viable operations. And then finally, 10 plus years out, we would be looking at maturing operations. So before I turn it over to Clint, I just want to leave this thought with you. Advanced air mobility is a technology push market. What do I mean by that? We're here because of the confluence of different technologies: electric propulsion, distributed propulsion, autonomy, data networks, new materials that have allowed the aviation industry to create these new aircraft. But they're not here out of a specific market demand or request from local jurisdictions. It's not that cities said, if we could only find a way to move people through the air, we could address homelessness, poverty, job development, etc. So just like our mobile phones, when we got those 20 years ago, we thought, okay, cool new way to make a phone call. I didn't know I needed this. And now we can't live without them, and the last thing we do with them is make a phone call. We do everything else with them. So this is our technology opportunity that we can consider for future growth and transportation needs in communities. What could we use this for, and how could advanced air mobility contribute to the overall transportation system? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Clint to talk about aircraft, airspace, and infrastructure. And after Clint speaks, we'll pause for the first Q&A session.
All right, I appreciate that, Yolanka. I'm gonna move around because it's morning time. So really appreciate the opportunity to present here. My name is Clint Harper. I am a community advocate within advanced air mobility, not necessarily an advanced air mobility advocate, Yolanka. I'm a community advocate. And how I got here was, so my aviation career began 25 years ago in the United States Air Force. I spent 6 years maintaining communications, navigations, and sensor equipment on AC-130 gunships. I learned how aircraft navigate through the airspace, communicate with other aircraft, communicate with the ground, and that really just gave me a great introduction into what aviation is, and it provided me with an opportunity to further my career that I would have had otherwise. And so I love aviation. I owe a debt of gratitude to aviation, and I want to do my part in making aviation better for everybody else. As I said, after 6 years, I realized that when I looked around me, and the people back then that are my age now looked really cranky and just didn't look like they enjoyed, coming to work every day. And so I thought, I don't want to be that when I get, to that age. So I looked for opportunities to explore other career options. And the Air Force allows you to cross-train into a different career field after your first enlistment. And I chose airfield management, which on the civilian side is more closely aligned to airport operations, airport planning. And that's where I did the rest of my career. I learned all about aviation infrastructure. I planned, designed, built, and most of all, operated airports, heliports, UAV facilities, and supported a wide, diverse case of different use cases. And so everything infrastructure, I lived, breathed, and woke up, living aviation infrastructure. And so that's what became my passion. That's what fueled me. And when I retired in 2014, I had to return to school to get a degree, and I chose community planning because I've always had a fascination for cities. I've always had a fascination with the built environment, what made good cities and good neighborhoods good, and what made bad cities and bad neighborhoods bad. Traveling with the Air Force, I got to visit a lot of cool places in Europe, and I just thought, why is this place so much cooler than Harrisburg, Pennsylvania? And so I really just wanted to understand how that happens, how that emerges. And so community planning, urban planning really fit that bill. What I didn't expect in that program was to learn about everything that planners do to help with some of the social issues within our cities. And so I didn't know, all the things that planners did to try and help for transportation inequities, how to solve for homelessness. And what really became passionate for me was how, to solve for food insecurity. And so I began asking the question, what is aviation doing to solve for those issues? And the initial answer that I had was not enough. And it got to the point to where I became bitter on aviation, and I wanted to leave aviation. And that kind of broke my heart because aviation really gave me opportunities that I never would have had in my life otherwise. But I committed to leaving aviation. I explored traditional planning programs or traditional planning careers, urban design, transportation planning. But towards the end of my master's program, I had an instructor pulled me aside and said, "Hey, Clint, I hear you're thinking about leaving aviation. Can you tell me why?" And I told him what I just told you, and he said, "That's really great. The problem is I see, you're older, and you're going to try and make it in this career field. If you go out there and get a job within a traditional planning office, you're going to be sitting among people who think exactly like you. So you're really not going to set yourself apart in that way, and it's going to be hard for you to thrive, in that space. And not saying that you won't, but, it's going to be difficult." So what he suggested to me was consider re-engaging in aviation. And if I have issues with aviation, if I have problems, with what aviation is not doing, then to bring those values that I learned in that planning program at the University of Utah to the industry and be a change for good. And so be a force for change, from within in aviation. And so that became my passion moving forward. And I took everything I learned about, how aircraft move to the sky, how infrastructure is developed, and I sought to help create aviation infrastructure that is better stewards, for the communities that they serve. And so my first role outside of, on the civilian side, was as the state airport system planner for the state of Utah. And I did that through the lens of economic development. So I really worked to help small airports understand their role in a region's economy, how small airports can attract jobs to a region, and how we can strategize different land use and transportation planning strategies to maximize the use of those airports. And did that through all out the state, and that's when the advanced air mobility industry really started taking off and gave me an opportunity to expand that into more urban settings. That really kind of solidified my role as a community advocate in this space, and it also led to one of the most rewarding phases of my career, which was as the Advanced Air Mobility Fellow for the City of Los Angeles, where I helped them start to understand what this industry was, what the opportunities were, separate the hype from the real opportunities. And it was a really great experience for me to work with some of the best planners on the planet and how they're looking at integrating advanced air mobility in a holistic manner. And so today, I'm doing a kind of a multiple gigs. That fellowship ended earlier this year. I have a part-time role with NASA, and then on the other side, I do consulting to keep food on the table. And so happy to be here and happy to dive into what we're going to talk about in terms of aircraft, aerospace, and infrastructure. So let's start with the aircraft. So Yolanka already gave us a good introduction of the aircraft and the use cases. What does this mean for communities, and how do communities understand their role in the ecosystem that is shaping around advanced air mobility? So it all starts with the aircraft. If we don't have aircraft, if we don't have a vehicle to get into the air, then we have no need for anything else. And so aircraft really root the regulatory environment of how these are operating. It starts to take, give shape to how communities are going to operate within this space. And so when we look at aircraft certification, the FAA and the federal government looks at it through a number of different parts. You got your Part 23, which is your normal aircraft. This is your normal little Cessnas, single engine prop planes that you see at your small airports. You have your Part 25 transport aircraft, which is what a lot of us may use when we fly across the country. Part 27 rotorcraft and Part 29 rotorcraft, similarly mimic what happens on the these normal. So small aircraft, big aircraft, small helicopters, large helicopters, and they're all certified via their their own specific way, given the use cases that they intend to use. AAM aircraft don't really fit the bill for any of these, and so there is a provision within the Part 121 requirements over there that kind of sets the framework for how aircraft are certified. There's a paragraph in there that talks about if you don't have an aircraft that fits neatly with any one of these buckets, then you can pull what makes sense to certify that aircraft from each of those ones. And so that's what electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft are going to use as allowed by Part 21, Section 21.17 Bravo. And so this is what the future looks like. There's a lot of focus, eVTOL aircraft, or there's a lot of focus around eVTOL aircraft, and rightfully so. They're insanely cool. They really are the ones that kick this space off, but they're not the only players in this space. When we look at eVTOL aircraft, who are going to be the initial users, it's still likely in the early days going to be executives, individuals of high net worth. The thing that I always try and tell communities to help them understand and wrap their head around this is aviation has always served to move high value, time critical goods or cargo, and that can be people or our consumer goods. And that's not really going to change with the advanced air mobility space. What will change is the calculus around how we define high value time critical. Whereas today, high value time critical, in terms of a person that uses a helicopter charter, might be somebody making north of 7 figures. Hopefully tomorrow with eVTOLs, we're going to start moving the needle down, and it's not going to be the flip of a switch. We're not going to see these Uber prices that you hear in the news a lot of times, in 2025 after the aircraft are first certified. It's going to take time to start moving the needle down there. And so what I also want to talk about is the short takeoff and landing, the traditional aircraft, and then the UAS cargo movements. All of those, we all get things delivered. We all rely on consumer goods that are moving via freight. These are use cases that we can all benefit from that can also leverage the existing infrastructure that we have at our community airports. If you look at the news and do some Google searching on what is the most critical thing that the biggest threat for advanced air mobility, you're going to see a lot of articles around infrastructure, available infrastructure that's out there, because when we focus the story around the eVTOLs, we're looking at vertiports, or vertical takeoff and landing infrastructure within dense urban environments. And so essentially what that means is that we're trying to bring infrastructure, aviation infrastructure, closer to a high density of destinations. Whereas if we're using these other use cases, we have an opportunity to do the flip side of that, and that is bring in destinations, in closer to the infrastructure. And so those are the things that I worked on in Utah, was trying to come up with land use and transportation strategies around airports, that is going to better maximize those airports for the future. And Yolanka already talked about these use cases, but they're very important. When we look at how are we going to engage with this technology in the future, how are your community members, your constituents going to engage, with this technology in the future? Some of it might be more of the air metro, commuter taxi, type services, regional air mobility. But more than likely, a lot of us are going to benefit more directly from the cargo movement, how this is going to streamline our logistics systems and how we get access to the goods that we use every day. And so with the aircraft also, so now we're getting into things that are more concerning to communities. Aircraft have to operate somewhere, and they operate within the airspace system of the United States, which is regulated by the FAA. And the way I try and teach this to communities is it's like nesting dolls. You have the big airspace that's out there over top of our country, and then what the FAA has done is segmented that into airspace classifications. And this is usually where most training and education programs will stop, is they'll stop at, hey, you have Class B, C, and D airspaces around our nation's airports, and then Class A is where the airliners, transit through, and then you have these other types of airspace that fill in the gaps in between, and that's that. What they don't get to is, once you get into the Class B, C, and D, you have other airspace considerations. You have Part 77 airspaces, which are around our airports, and these serve to protect these airports and protect the safety of aviation operations around the airports so that there's no hazards in place. At busy airports, we have instrument procedures. These imaginary surfaces protect these procedures the aircraft intend to fly in adverse weather conditions. When they can't see the ground, when they can't see around them, the precision procedures give them a route to follow that has been cleared of obstructions. It's going to be cleared by air traffic control of other aircraft, and that's how this aviation system operates safely. And so these are just again, examples. This isn't intended to teach you what everything is here. I taught this in the Air Force, and it was insanely fun, but it was like a 3-day course to get everybody to understand this. But this is more just to illustrate that these exist out there, and this is how aviation operates today, and this is where this aviation ecosystem starts to impact communities more closely, because this is what's allowing aircraft to fly low, around neighborhoods, generating noise concerns and things of that nature. And so how do these aircraft operate? This gets into the operational rules. This aviation is highly regulated. That's what makes it so safe. So you got aircraft that are certified under a certain FAR part, and then they're going to operate under a certain set of rules, within various FAR parts. Your normal aircraft operate under Part 91, or they can operate under Part 135, which is like the air taxi, which is what we're going to see in the future with a lot of these aircraft. What we're used to, how most of us probably engage in aviation on a more frequent basis, is through the Part 25. We take airlines, to get to where we're going. They operate under Part 121, which is a very rigorous operational standard, but they can also operate under the other two. We know John Travolta has, his own private jets, which are Part 25 certified aircraft, but he operates them under Part 91 as a private owner of those facilities. And you got the same thing going on for the rotorcraft. Now when we add infrastructure into the mix, and this is really where communities intersect this industry, things start to get a little bit more murky. Again, normal aircraft operate Part 91 or Part 135. They operate at general aviation airports. General aviation airports aren't certified under a certain part, but they are maintained in accordance with advisory circulars that the FAA publishes. Transport category aircraft, they do have a regulated airport that they have to operate of. All airports that service transport category aircraft for the purpose of Part 121 scheduled operations, SFO, San Jose, Monterey. They are a Part 139 certified airport. Again, another rigorous standard, that they have to maintain in order to accommodate those ops. And for Part 27, there is a design for a general aviation heliport, which is what we see most across the United States. And then under Part 29, there was intentions of mimicking this, the Part 121. There used to be a Part 127 that existed for transport category heliports or helicopters. And they were going to use the transport category heliport, which does exist within the design guidelines today, but there are no heliports out there in existence in the United States that currently meet the transport heliport design criteria. So now it gets really tricky because how do we maintain these in a safe way? Who's overseeing this infrastructure? Well, at general aviation airports and commercial service airports, they are subsidized by the FAA. They receive money from the federal government to operate. And so because they receive money from the FAA, their grant, when they receive a grant, they agree to follow the FAA's design guidance and their advisory circulars and hold those airports to that standards. Private airports and heliports, which the vast majority of heliports are, the FAA doesn't have any teeth to regulate, those facilities. And so, some states might oversee them. Some states have a licensing program, but things start falling apart at this point for heliports, where we're looking at starting initial eVTOL operations at. And so to show you, when we talk about aviation being the safest mode of transportation, in the world, in the United States, what we're talking about is airline operations. And so we have this harmonization from a transport aircraft that operates under Part 121 scheduled airline rules, lands at a Part 139 scheduled airport, and flies within Part 71 and Part 77 airspace. With all that being harmonized, we are able to enable the safest transport system on the planet. That doesn't exist yet for helicopters in private facilities. And so that's where, I think there's more education that's needed with our state officials. There's more education needed with our local officials, so that they can understand what's sitting in their backyard. They can understand, when we do things to heliports, when we don't maintain them to a certain standard, what risks we're allowing to take place. And so here's an example. This is a heliport. This is a recent Google Earth image. This marking on the heliport is dated. This hasn't been in use. The standard for this type of marking hasn't been in use since I think of the early 2000s. Is there a laser pointer? Nope. No laser? Okay. So, outdated marking. The way that H is oriented, you have an approach path coming from this direction, which you can see has trees, 30 to 40 foot palm trees right in its pathway. If this was overseen by the FAA, this would never happen. If this is overseen by a state official, that would never happen. This is a very unsafe facility. But because this is a privately owned heliport, there's just not enough rules to make sure that a facility like this stays safe. How this heliport is communicated, if you look at the FAA's records on this facility, it shows that we have a 120 foot by a 60 foot helipad. That's a large facility. It's a very safe facility, but that's not what's marked here. What's marked here is a small helipad on the left here and a parking spot on the right. And so now there's a mismatch in what the FAA, if you just called up and said, hey, FAA, I want to know about this facility, they're going to tell you, oh, well, it's great. It's 120 foot wide, long by 60 feet wide. It's going to be really safe. When you get there, and there happens to be another helicopter on this other pad, now you got issues. It's not what you planned for. And so now your operations, might be compromised. And so the reason I explain all this is because the infrastructure is really what we're building on for the future, and what communities have a large role in, for the future. If we're going to enable all this future infrastructure from the vertiports, the multimodal hubs, and all that kind of stuff, but our foundation is what I showed you in the slide previously, we have a challenge ahead of us. We got to make sure that our foundation is strong, when we're moving ahead in this. So if what we want to evolve from is heliports, and the FAA has stated this over and over again through its multiple documents, including the recent Innovate 28 document, we want to use heliports as the initial entry point for in terms of infrastructure, we got to make sure our heliports are ready. And that starts with understanding where they stand today, where the risks are today, and empowering communities and states to enforce and oversee the safety of those facilities. And I'll fly through this because I think I'm starting to get over time here, but there's just a lot of confusion on what constitutes a heliport. When we talk about LA, LA was attractive because they have all these facilities that they look at from a Google Earth view and say, oh, I want to land at those. Those are emergency use only. Those are very, very dangerous. A lot of them have HVAC, equipment all around it. Some of them have antennas. When you get up there, and I've been on some of these, there's an axe when you get out the emergency exit that says chop down this, this, and this in order for a helicopter to land safely and rescue you. So we want to make sure that we understand what is intended to be a heliport and what is intended to be an emergency use only facility. And so that's what the large situation in Los Angeles looks like today. And then when we get into the infrastructure, it's more than just heliports. We're also looking at charging. These aircraft need to charge, and so how do we get charging up to the top of those buildings? How do we get charging to our airports? How do we maximize, the potential associated with that charging? Is there an opportunity to create microgrids at our airports that can serve the communities? Is there an opportunity to leverage, the increasing demand at these facilities to make them, turn them into resiliency hubs for communities where they can serve communities in events of a natural disaster or event? And then we get into challenges of standardization. There's not yet a charging standardization for these aircraft yet. And so now you're faced with the question of, am I going to enable aircraft X, or am I going to enable aircraft Y? I can't just put one facility in to accommodate them both. Which one do I support? That's going to create challenges. Weather is a critical one that's not often talked about. So when we look at weather, our weather system today was largely built out to support the transport category aircraft. The weather that informs the weather forecast, and I'm sure you looked at this morning, in part was built out to support the airliners flying through the sky today at a high level. Those, because our need was at a higher level, and we never had to get down to the surface level where a lot of these aircraft are going to be flying. So below 5,000 feet, we really don't know what's going on, with the microclimate and how that's going to impact aircraft flight, how it's going to impact small UAS operations. And when we look at heliports, the design standard right now says you have an option between putting in a $5,000 windsock or a 200 to 500K automated weather system, and there's nothing in between. The weather conditions when you're looking at on top of a facility, do different things. If an aircraft is coming in for a landing on this facility, the wind cone might not communicate to the pilot that there's a downdraft right here. And if he doesn't know that's there, he may have a difficult time adjusting to that to make for a safe landing. And we see accidents on top of hospital heliports probably more regularly than because of the microclimate conditions that exist up there. And then this is the condition of most of the windsocks that I look at rooftop facilities. So is this going to communicate to a pilot, what the current conditions are? And then finally, I'll leave it with the aircraft rescue and firefighting. All airports have firefighting capabilities, on the airport. And they're there to respond to those specific incidences and incidences. When we have a downtown facility or a facility that is at a small location, we're going to expect the local fire department to serve that. Are local fire departments ready to respond to an incident involving an electric aircraft? And this can just raise questions. I think as community members, you need to understand what are the challenges, what do we need to prepare for, and most importantly, where are we going to get the money? If we need extra apparatuses, if we need new technology to respond to electric aircraft fires, where is the funds going to come from to support that? And so I will leave it at that. And if I went over, I forgot to start my timer, so if I did go over, I apologize.
You did not.
Okay.
You're right on time. Thank you, Clint. So we're going to stay up there. We're going to pause for a few minutes just to ask if there are any questions, and I can run to you with the microphone so that we can all hear the question. Does anybody have questions so far? Josh.
I'll get us started here. I know there's some planners, transportation planners in the room, and some airport managers too, so I'll expect some of the questions from those people as well. But how are local communities like this area, Monterey region, organizing that from the work that you all are doing? How far down the road are they in thinking about these subjects, and how are they kind of orienting to try to address some of these points that you brought up?
Yeah, I'll answer that, and I'm sure Yolanka has something to say about that as well. I think the fact that you're having this event in Monterey, shows how far along we've come, even from 2 years ago. Communities and even airports, for a large part, because this was so new, there's like, oh, this is just the future, flying cars, Jetsons, not in my lifetime, type of situation. I think the reality, these aircraft, for the last year, the FAA has been supportive of a certification date of 2025. And so now we have Innovate 28 that was released earlier this year that's looking at some kind of operational scaling by 2028. And so more communities are coming together. The challenge is on the funding side. Transportation planners often have some discretionary funding, buckets of money that they can pull from to study disruptive transportation technologies. Some of that planning can be done at a high level, but because most of this infrastructure is privately developed, that falls in the laps of land use planners in many cases. And land use planners have a much tighter budget to work with often, as I've learned. They have to get a motion from their city council, which means that they have to have some kind of support within the community that's saying, hey, let's plan for this, and here are some resources to do so. It's one of the most frustrating things that I experienced in talking with community members was, well, we don't want to enable this without knowing more about it, so we want the city to plan for it. It's like, okay, that's great. We need to plan for it. Let's talk to your city council member. Let's get a motion going. Let's make this happen. Whoa. We don't want to get a motion going. We don't want to, allocate any resources towards it, but we want you to study it so that we understand what it is. Well, the studying doesn't happen for free. There needs to be some kind of, resource allocation to allocate for that. And so that's kind of I think where some communities are starting to spin their wheels is that, I think they understand that there's a need to plan, but there's really not a mechanism, right now that's pushing that forward.
Thanks, Clint. And I'll add to that. I mean, that question is the core reason we started CAMI, was just to try to bridge that gap, because we were in a little bit of a chicken and egg situation of where this starts. I think what we're seeing, we're certainly seeing communities across the country start to think about this at the state and local, regional and tribal level. I will say that probably the biggest gap that we're seeing so far is at the regional, the MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization level. And it's the reason we've been developing the resources we have. So I'll just go ahead and say now that we have just finished up with UC Berkeley, with Adam, who you'll hear from next, a planning guide for advanced air mobility that was funded by the Mineta Transportation Institute and will be published by the American Planning Association, I don't know, by the end of the year, do we think? Early next year? We also just completed with Mead and Hunt a funded project that is a primer for airports and local communities on community integration, as well as a whole toolkit for working with their communities, including workshop presentations, handouts, surveys, etc. So there's a lot of work to be done, and part of the critical challenge here is that planning and funding take time. So we do get into that chicken and egg situation of when, how do communities start this process if they're not even sure what it looks like?
I'll add on one final thing before we move on to the next question. There are some heliports that are starting to look at this saying, all right, well, we know these questions are coming to us, and they're starting to be proactive. So, why I have some bags under my eyes, right now is because I spent the weekend in Chicago doing a heliport evaluation at a facility there that is getting ready for advanced air mobility and eVTOL operations. And they know those questions are coming, and so they're being proactive and saying, let's get a good idea because we haven't had anybody come and look at this facility since it was opened. So let's get a refreshed idea of where we stand so that we know what we have to do to make sure we're going to be safe and we can answer those questions from the community when they come.
Yes, hi. My name is Peter Vendevender, Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Thank you, Clint. Thank you, Yolanka, for a very clear presentation. I've been at your presentations before, but this goes deeper and more profound. I think I needed it to better do my job. My job is I connect basically what's happening on mobility between the state of California and Western Europe. So this includes all forms of transportation. This is a new form. And we are looking at this very closely within the governor's office to see what it means and how we should interact. And long-term, short-term, and also in terms of international collaboration. Mm-hmm. Last year, Yolanka and others were part of a larger mission that we organized, and there's going to be a larger mission from European stakeholders coming to visit California and see what's happening here in the United States. But I have a question for you. So when this is through the lens of California, what is very important and very apparent, that in all that we do in long-term, long-range land use planning, and we look at the past and we look at the future, underserved communities have been underserved, yes. Literally. And if we do not change course, they will be underserved also moving forward.
Yes.
This technology, this great innovation, all these new opportunities have the risk that they will basically continue what we have been doing for 100+ years. And this is not only the United States, this is in Europe, it's elsewhere in the world. So, and you're talking about communities, and I really appreciate that. I think it's very important that you reach out to these communities. What I'm trying to do in the next few years is to make sure that underserved communities are part of this. So my very, open question, but it starts with a closed-end question. Have you been communicating with underserved communities in the United States, or, better even yet, in California? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes, you have. Okay. That's what I was hoping you would answer. Now, the second is a little bit more complicated. Can you sort of describe to me how you engage in that process and what were some of the initial outcomes? Thank you.
Yeah. First, I really appreciate the conversation. I'm going to take this microphone back out here because I can't hold still and answer that question because it's one of my passions. Yeah, so you're spot on. If you go to any airport today, in any kind of built-up environment, the communities that surround that airport are traditionally going to be, underserved, marginalized communities. They're the ones bearing the brunt of all the negative externalities associated with noise, emissions, and they do not have access typically, to the services that airport offers. So there's an imbalance there. And this was highlighted when I did an economic impact study for all the airports in Utah, where everybody was impressed, by the economic outputs that were generated by these airports. But when we started looking at, just people who worked at the airport, who badge holders, had access to the airport and looked at their zip codes, none of them were those community members that surrounded that. And so we started trying to learn, how do we do this? How do we, reverse this balance, and how do we get those communities represented into this? And so that's what's driving a lot of these, how do we create jobs at airports? How do we create, new opportunities at airports? How do we make them multimodal? Most airports are bimodal. How do we make them multimodal so that, the airport serves as a resource not just for aviation users, but, for transportation users as a whole, the transit users in particular? And then getting into your specific question, when I first took the job as the Advanced Air Mobility Fellow in Los Angeles, I wanted to kind of rip the Band-Aid off on any kind of difficult conversation that I was going to have. And so we reached out we did some research first and found out who absolutely hated, advanced air mobility. When the Urban Air Mobility Partnership was announced in LA through the governor's office there, we looked at the social media response, and a lot of the social media response was surrounded about, or came from, bicycle and pedestrian advocacy groups, transportation advocacy groups, because they were working to solve the very problem that you just talked about. They want to make transportation more equitable, and they want to promote those modes that are more equitable and serve, the people that don't have access to the higher end stuff. And so working with them, we got a better idea of their sensitivities and their ideas. And one of the things that was interesting in our messaging, most of them did some research about what advanced air mobility was or urban air mobility was. And that's problematic because there's so much hype out there on this industry that if you do a Google search, you're guaranteed to see flying cars. You're guaranteed to see the Jetsons. You're guaranteed to see these, these renderings of, very good-looking, affluent people getting into an aircraft that's in some natural area, and they don't see themselves, in those renderings and stuff. What I tried to communicate to them is, within aviation, what do you all hate? What does everybody hate about aviation, whether you're a user or not? Well, I think everybody, more or less aligns on that we do not like noise, we don't like the emissions, and then for most of us, we don't like the fact that we can't access it on a regular basis, but we still have to deal with the noise and emissions. And so when we look at advanced air mobility beyond the eVTOLs, we're looking at reducing noise, we're looking at hopefully eliminating emissions, and through time, like I said, it's not going to be a flip of a switch, we're looking at making it more accessible. And when we frame advanced air mobility in that respect, more people start to see, like, all right, well, transportation as a whole, like you said, every mode, all over the world, has been developed in a very inequitable way. And all modes are trying to reverse course and right the ship on that. And aviation is now just getting on that same pathway of trying to figure out, first recognize that we've done wrong in the past, and then acknowledge that we need to do better, and then start taking those steps. And we're still in the very, very early stages of that. And so I don't have any solid, like, really good answers to say how we're going to do that. I have a lot of ideas. I've had the opportunity to testify before Congress on community integration. And in that, I shared some ideas. I had a personal response to the US DOT's RFI that was a few months ago that talked about the concept of resiliency hubs, about leveraging, if we're going to put infrastructure anywhere, they can't be a one-trick pony. Airports can't be a one-trick pony. Vertiports can't be a one-trick pony. They need to be 10-trick ponies, and they need to serve the communities. And so there's good ideas out there, and then we get into the challenge of how do we push those ideas forward? How do we work with community members to understand, which set of ideas they like? Do they have new ideas? Push that forward. And what I think we're also learning in transportation as a whole is that engagement is intensive, and anything intensive costs money. The precedent in transportation as a whole, including aviation, is we check the box. We'll put a public notice out there, a registered notice, and we'll open up a comment period. We'll adjudicate those in a very, methodological manner, and then we'll move on. True engagement, is much more intensive than that. True listening sessions is much more intensive than that, and that's expensive. And so I think the realization that we need to plan ahead for that and understand that we can't just do the check-the-box exercises that we did in the past. We need to get out there and have listening sessions, talk to people, get their ideas, have charrettes, the whole 9 yards, is really what's going to help us provide solutions to those problems and understand how do we help aviation right the ship, so to speak, along with all the other transportation modes. I'm sorry, that was long-winded.
Thank you, Clint. I'm going to suggest that we actually come back to that question after we hear from Adam. And hold on one second, because Adam's going to talk more about planning. And I will come back and talk about community engagement a bit. But I do want to make one comment, and that is that when it comes to accessibility and affordability and equity around aviation, again, this is where it's really important to look at advanced air mobility as a component of a transportation system, and how do we use it to make the entire system work better for underserved communities. So it may not be that that person in that underserved community is taking an AAM vehicle, but by creating, for instance, multimodal hubs, can we increase levels of service of transit as well? In other words, can we make the entire system better by adding a new mode? So I'll leave you all to think about that as we do the planning session. I think we have one more question. Let's make it quick so that we can move on, because I think there will be more questions after we hear from Adam.
Thanks, Nick. I'm Matt Nelson, the airport manager, Marina Municipal Airport. one thing I've noticed as a fly on the wall watching Joby advance so quickly is that if you were to take a look at 40,000 feet, the eVTOL companies are far more advanced in their rollout and capabilities. My concern is that the FAA has been given this charge of integrating this into their airspace. Would you agree? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know the FAA is at times underworked or overworked, understaffed, and they've got issues, and I think a lot of it has been put on their laps. I also encourage that they engage consultants outside the FAA, much like NASA did with their space programs. I know it's a lot of questions bouncing around here, but I feel like the technology is already here. It's going to be here before the FAA is able to integrate it into the air system.
Yeah, and I think even the FAA would recognize, the technology is evolving a lot faster than regulation is able to keep up with, which, if you looked in the early days of AAM visions, they were going to be all autonomous, and there was going to be a pilot on board. But the realities of, hey, we have to integrate into the system, we have to iterate, from what we have today, to allow the regulators to keep up, in lockstep with that, has prompted, hey, and also realities of just where the technology truly is, that we need to put a pilot on board. We need to, figure out how this is going to operate with the current regulations, and then, as we understand, what the pathway is to iterate safely from that, then that's completely possible and do so. But yeah, I would agree with you. I think, if you look at a lot of the publications out there and stuff, even many people, acknowledge the challenge, that the technology is evolving much faster than the regulation environment, is. And I think there's a lot of optimism, right now with the nomination for a new FAA administrator, that we're going to see some movement on that. So I'll just leave it on that optimistic note, that things are, kind of trending in the right direction, and we'll hope for the best. And so with that, I won't hold Adam up any longer.
Thank you, Clint.
Thank you. Adam Cohen, Senior Research Manager at the Transportation Sustainability Research Center at UC Berkeley. As kind of Yolanka already kind of mentioned, we've done a lot of work on kind of planning, kind of policy and equity. And at a really kind of high level, kind of in the Cliff Notes version of this is that really kind of what's going on here is that local governments, and to a large extent even MPOs, they haven't been really kind of involved in aviation-related issues. And you've got a whole kind of new set of kind of aviation stakeholders. And really kind of this space for advanced air mobility, for UAS or drones, is really kind of about kind of integrating these two different stakeholder groups together and getting everybody to kind of speak a kind of a common language for common outcomes. So there's a number of kind of potential community concerns with advanced air mobility. And from a community perspective, these kind of generally kind of fall into kind of four buckets. The first kind of category is related to kind of flight paths and kind of en route operations. Everything from location and time of day of flights to issues related to air congestion and frequency of flights to privacy, noise, and visual pollution impacts. And then there's kind of the second bucket, which is really kind of around kind of vertiport and airport placement. And so these are direct environmental impacts related to kind of vertiport vicinity, as well as kind of social and economic impacts around vertiports, which could include more traditional planning topics such as gentrification and displacement. Then there's also kind of service characteristics, and that's kind of the third category. Are the services affordable? Are the aircraft ADA accessible? Those types of issues. And then the final kind of category is what I kind of would say is kind of cross-cutting issues. And this includes things such as environmental justice, and this idea that if we allocate public resources to advanced air mobility, are we doing it at the expense of another type of public investment? So one of the things that our team has developed over at UC Berkeley for the U.S. Department of Transportation is this, what we call kind of the STEPS framework. And it's this idea of looking at equity beyond just kind of traditional statutory definitions. So STEPS stands for spatial, temporal, economic, physiological, and social. And it's this idea that looking at kind of AAM through kind of this multifaceted lens, are we serving all areas in terms of geographic coverage? Are we providing different coverage for different types of users at different times of day? Is it economically accessible to all? And there's a lot of talk about this from the passenger mobility side, but I think we should also remember that whether we're talking about logistics, drone delivery, even air ambulance services, there's an affordability component to each of those different types of use cases. Physiological barriers, everything from access for people with disabilities to difficulty using digital platforms to access the services, as well as kind of social barriers. And that's kind of a cross-cutting category that can include a variety of different things. So fundamentally, one of the things that we think is really important is this kind of idea of kind of physical, fair payment, and information integration. Making sure that all of these things come together, making sure that advanced air mobility kind of fits in with not just all three of these, but with other modes of transportation to kind of create that multimodal network. One of the things that we released in 2020 was the US DOT's Mobility on Demand Planning and Implementation Guide. The link is available here. And what this guide does is provide early recommendations for how to integrate all of these services, including advanced air mobility, as well as shared AVs, transportation network companies, and other forms of shared mobility. So one of the things that we think is really important when we start looking at these this multimodal integration is kind of this concept of mobility areas. This idea that we'll have kind of an intermodal facility at the heart or the core, kind of surrounded by a zone, which could include active transportation modes, and then a broader catchment area with public transportation and motorized modes. So we kind of strongly believe that kind of co-locating multiple modes together really can kind of create kind of what I call kind of a multimodal multiplier, where kind of the sum of each of these modes is greater than kind of their individual parts. And we also believe that kind of integrating with services such as mobility on demand and mobility as a service is also very important as well. So one of the things that we've done a lot of work with the US DOT on is this idea of kind of the complete trip concept. That idea is that if one link in a trip is not accessible, it's not accessible for everybody or anybody. And so this idea that each connection point must be both physically accessible and digitally accessible for people with disabilities, but also other populations as well, whether you're low income, unbanked, underbanked, so on and so forth. And so really looking at AAM not as a single mode, but how it kind of fits together door to door, origin to destination. The other thing that we've done a lot of work on with the American Planning Association that will be kind of released early next year is this idea of public-private partnerships, allocation of limited public resources to include right-of-way. And we've got to kind of think of both airspace, also physical vertiports, all as kind of right-of-way that gets managed. And so in this kind of context, in terms of managing the physical space, there's a lot of lessons learned that we can apply from forms of shared mobility. And one of the ways that we can do that is allocating resources based on service characteristics, allocating different gate or parking or landing slots, valuing access, so essentially kind of using pricing at key points of peak periods, and also kind of managing competition between service providers, use cases, and developing processes for dispute resolution. So in simplest terms, the way that I kind of give an example of this is if you go to a major airport such as Reagan or JFK, we're over capacity. There's more operators that want to operate there than we have gate or runway slots. And so we may get in a position where there are some highly congested locations in the future at particular areas where we need to start thinking about in advance proactively how we might kind of manage this. And so some of the ways that kind of competition can kind of be managed among operators, and this comes from a lot of our earlier work on kind of shared modes, is this idea of kind of first come, first serve. That's kind of one way, kind of order of request, lottery processes, so kind of random drawings, auctions, giving those spaces to kind of the highest bidder, preferential treatment. So maybe we want to prioritize emergency response or humanitarian use cases, for example. Collaborative approaches, so getting stakeholders together and trying to kind of mutually negotiate allocation of resources. Using kind of RFP processes, such as bidding processes, or what we call kind of tandem policies. So if there's two service providers that want access, we're going to divide up access equally among those. So these are some examples, and the planning guidebook that's going to be coming out will be kind of talking about this in a little bit greater detail. So one of the things that CAMI and our partners have released recently with NASA is this kind of emerging practices playbook. And it's meant to be pretty high level, provide a look at kind of what some early practices in kind of 9 key topic areas, including institutional readiness, equity and community engagement, planning and multimodal integration, data, funding, economic development and workforce readiness, operations and interoperable infrastructure, and sustainability environmental impacts. We'll include a link for everybody for this, and we encourage you to kind of take a look at this. It has information on early policy considerations, research, and other things for public agencies to look at. I do want to kind of talk a little bit about kind of state and local planning before kind of I wrap up and turn it back over to Yolanka. You know, the metropolitan planning organizations play a really crucial role in kind of transportation planning, you know, at a regional level. And I think it's really important as we start going forward to really kind of integrate advanced air mobility into those processes. At present, aviation really is not integrated well into those processes, largely because the funding is separate. But that doesn't mean that we still can't leverage MPOs and their planning processes and their stakeholders to help kind of achieve, I think, synergies between surface and air transportation. So this figure here really kind of depicts the typical process that they go through to develop kind of regional transportation plans. And that kind of goes up to the state level, and then resources are allocated back down. And so we would encourage our federal stakeholders as well as state governments to really kind of look at ways to integrate AM into these existing processes. So how will advanced air mobility be integrated into communities? From a planning perspective, there's a few different ways this could occur. One of them is through comprehensive planning, or in the state of California, we kind of refer to it as general planning. This is integrating it into kind of long-range planning documents that really kind of guide kind of visions for communities. Also kind of looking at subdivision regulations and plans. How can we kind of incorporate this into kind of new master plan communities, specific infrastructure plans, capital improvement plans, and as well as broader kind of growth policies. Do we want to leverage or use advanced air mobility to guide or encourage growth? Do we want to maybe use it to limit growth? And examples of this could be, maybe we want to place a vertiport in a location where we don't want density, and so we're going to limit heights around a particular location. Do we want to employ, for example, urban growth boundaries if we're concerned about sprawl related to vertiports? And so these are all important kind of planning considerations that I think will need to be looked at. So there's a really important kind of local role in this area, and the planning guidebook will go into greater details on these topics, but really kind of a need to establish local zoning codes for advanced air mobility. There are some examples from heliports, but there could be some analogies with vertiports, but there may be some differences. So what kinds of zoning needs to be in place? What are the specific building code requirements that are needed? Housing codes. And this is kind of an interesting one because on the one perspective, we want vertiports to be like kind of transit-oriented development. We want them to be dense. We want them to be walkable. But there's also some concern about how you position housing related to noise concerns and other factors, including safety. And so we need to look very closely at housing policy and how this interfaces with vertiport locations. There's also maybe a role for developing conditional use permits, variances, and/or discretionary review for new vertiports or for converting existing land uses to vertiports. And finally, there's a code enforcement role at the local level. How do we make sure that vertiports are safe, that they're complying with local regulations such as fire codes? There's also a really kind of important kind of intersection between airspace access and land use. And so there needs to be close coordination between the FAA and state DOTs and local governments in terms of how we're locating facilities and where we're locating it in terms of policies and processes. I'll kind of conclude with kind of some key thoughts here. And we really kind of need to further kind of planning and policy to really kind of encourage socially optimal outcomes. And I think some key focus areas that are often overlooked include multimodal integration, land use, potential environmental impacts, and social equity. And so we strongly encourage research and demonstrations to kind of assist local and regional governments in terms of understanding technical institutional feasibility of various different deployments and use cases, understanding kind of impacts, and also kind of measuring impacts on users, non-users, community, and kind of broader societal outcomes. So with that being said, I'll be glad to kind of take some kind of questions, and then I'll kind of turn it over to Yolanka, who will wrap up. Okay. Sounds good.
All right, thank you, Adam. And yes, I'll do my last piece here on community engagement, and then we'll kind of combine those two in the Q&A. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about community engagement. So what is successful stakeholder engagement? Stakeholder engagement, the goal of stakeholder engagement is to increase trust among stakeholders and increase the likelihood of public acceptance. I'm going to pause there for a second. Let's just talk a little bit about what we mean by stakeholders and public acceptance. So when we think about stakeholders, we need to remember, or when we talk about community engagement, that there's a difference between all of the number of players, and we'll review that in a minute, and distinguishing between the general public. A lot of times when we talk about community engagement, people's minds immediately go to, we're talking to the person on the street. And it's broader than that. I just want to remind you of that. The other idea is, that I want to talk about is this idea of public acceptance. So public acceptance or product acceptance comes from a marketing, from the marketing world, from the product development world. And it's about how do you sell a product to somebody. Somebody once said to me, we accept that we have to pay taxes. There's a negative connotation to the term public acceptance. It has the connotation that this is coming, and how can we ease this the most for you so you're not going to cause problems. So at CAMI, we like to turn that conversation a little bit on its head and say this is not about putting these vehicles out there and saying you need to deal with them. This is about how do we work with communities to ensure that these are integrated in a way that the community wants them to be integrated. In other words, back to that slide I had before, what opportunities do we have to use this new technology in a way that benefits the community, that provides a broad level of public benefit, and that doesn't create disproportionate negative impacts on certain populations? So when you do successful stakeholder engagement, you increase that trust level because you broaden that conversation. You also promote equity and inclusion, and of course you support compliance with relevant federal and state laws. So you already saw this diagram before. Adam had this, but I'm just going to put it back up here for reference. Remember that we have two distinct communities that are coming together for this conversation. So on the aviation side, we've got federal government, the FAA, we've got port authorities, air carriers, operators, manufacturers. And on the other side, we have local communities. So who are we talking about? Elected officials, city councils, urban planners, transportation planners. We're talking about other transportation agencies, local residents and businesses, the general public, disadvantaged communities. And we need to bring these two communities together to do effective stakeholder engagement. Some of you may have seen this before. This comes from the International Association for Public Participation. A lot of times when we think about stakeholder engagement, we're on the left side of this diagram. We're informing, we're checking a box, we're sending communications one direction. This is what we're doing, this is what this will look like. For successful stakeholder engagement, we need to move to the right. We need to increase the level of engagement. We need to make this a two-way conversation. So instead of here's what's happening, how about what do you think? What ideas do you have? Let's solve this together. Or even we'll act on your decisions. So finding yourself on that spectrum and moving towards the right increases your level of success in working with a community to find a solution that the community embraces and doesn't just accept. In the new primer and toolkit that we developed a stakeholder engagement plan. And I'm just going to talk a few minutes about the components of that and what that looks like. So you want to start by identifying a leader or champion. So who's going to lead the efforts on stakeholder engagement? Needs to be somebody who is involved with the project, who knows about it, and who understands the importance of communication and this goal of two-way communication with stakeholders. It can be a small team, but identify who's owning this. The second piece is establish core goals, objectives. So what are you trying to accomplish? So as an agency, what do you want this, what looks like success for you when it comes to stakeholder engagement? So it has to be meaningful to your agency, but it also has to be a meaningful exercise for the people who are involved. So now you want to identify the stakeholders. Who are based on those goals and objectives, who are the people that should be coming to the room, who should be having this conversation? Are they other agencies, elected officials, local businesses, underserved communities, the general public? It's actually an important question, and there's a sequencing here. So what some of the communities that we've worked with have discovered is that if they went out to the general public and started doing outreach around advanced air mobility without talking to the local elected officials and agencies first, the general public, when they had questions, would go to those local elected officials, and those people were caught off guard. So understanding the dynamics and the kind of proper sequencing to make this work is really important. So who are the stakeholders? Do you bring everybody together? Is there kind of a layered approach? It's important to think about what that looks like for your community, your stakeholder outreach. So then the next piece, of course, is to develop the key messages. What are you trying to do? And think about that spectrum of engagement. Are you just presenting information? Are you looking for feedback? Are you setting up meetings? Are you developing a co-creation process? After that, it is time to develop an outreach plan. So when are you going to do this? Outreach plan communication materials kind of happen at the same time. You want to develop what you're going to share. Are these brochures? Are these emails? Are these, what is the form of your message? What does it look like? What is the wording? And what does the timeline look like for how you will do this? And then obviously next you actually do the outreach and you want to document what, take careful notes in terms of what the conversation is, what happens, and then monitor, assess, and follow up. That's a really important piece. If you do a workshop, do a tabletop exercise with the community and disappear, it's a very frustrating experience for the people who showed up, participated, provided their input. We have workshops this afternoon. It's the same kind of thing. It's important to maintain communication and make sure that you follow up and continue to create that, conversation around the topic. So that's really all I wanted to talk about on the stakeholder engagement plan. There we go. Before I head to Q&A, just needed you to stand up, and now let's see. I'm going to talk a little bit about our resources and our programs, and then I'll have Adam come back up. And,
Okay, that's working for me. Here you go.
all right, I just jinxed it. So as I said, CAMI's developed a number of resources, which you can find on our website. We have some short documents that are single topic documents. Some of them are at the top. Talked about the NASA guidebook. Adam had that, and the link is in the slides. So again, we developed that under a contract with NASA. We worked with 5 jurisdictions and through a series of workshops and focus groups, developed collectively those different emerging practices that you got a glimpse of. I have already mentioned the Planning for Advanced Air Mobility Guidebook that we have written that will be published by the American Planning Association early next year. You're starting to see some of those materials are incorporated in these presentations, as well as the Successful Community Inclusion in Advanced Air Mobility. That's the ACRP project. That is the primer and the toolkit. And again, that should be published either by the very end of this year, first of next year. In addition to that, we, of course, do these AAM 101s, but the other program I want to talk about quickly is our Urban Air Policy Collaborative and our cohort program. So we developed this a few years ago. This is about 18 to 20 hours of expert presentation and discussion. It happens online. It's open to public agencies and airports. Monterey DART and the Marina Airport were part of our cohort a couple of years ago. So you can see that what we do, the mission, the purpose of this program is to educate and collaboratively develop a framework of policy and best practices for the implementation of advanced air mobility. So we we have, you got a taste of it today with AAM 101. As I said, we meet weekly for 2 hours each week online and cover a broad set of modules, including kind of those AAM aviation fundamentals that you heard from Clint. We talk about social equity, we talk about legal and regulatory framework, we talk about multimodality, we talk about some of the environmental impacts like noise and visual pollution, we talk about infrastructure, we talk about charging and electricity and hydrogen. We do 2 modules on planning, vertiport siting, we talk about roles and responsibilities of different governments, etc. So if this is something that you're interested in, please let me know. Our 5th cohort is starting in a couple of weeks. Again, it's open to public agencies and airports. And with that, I think, a couple of upcoming events, as I mentioned, the next cohort. And then at the beginning of April, we are doing a conference with the National Renewable Energy Lab in Dallas on sustainable aviation energy. And we'll be doing another AAM 101 as part of that conference. So with that, I'm going to have Adam come back up. We can do a second Q&A. Actually, Clint, why don't you come up too, and we'll just see what questions people have.
Is this on? Okay.
We can all sit down.
I see some more airport managers have arrived, and planners and economic developers, so I'm expecting some good questions to follow on those that were offered earlier. I'll just say that this has really hit the spot on what we were looking for to get the conference started, as well as set the stage for this afternoon's workshops. So for all who can stick around, you're now deputized to be facilitators of community integration conversations at tables that we'll be having later with a larger group, now that you know what this means to some degree. But and in our framing, of course, we're gonna include not only the subjects of air mobility, but also with the advancing agricultural technology field in this region, we'll try to incorporate that into our conversations. But before we do that, with such rich information and delivery, does anyone here have a question before I ask one? Not seeing any. Robotics.
I think back here. Do we have a question?
Ah, thank you. Great.
Hi, I'm Joel Bittner. I'm representing mosquito control across the country, actually. And a couple things in your conversation sparked a couple of questions for me. One is mosquito control has been working with local governments and aviation for decades. And so a lot of what was said kind of resonates well. We also work closely with planning. My district in Placer County regularly comments on planning decisions at the individual plans or general plan level that affect mosquito production and public health. So my question is, with AAM, have there been considerations to public health impacts or integration with some of these new concepts? And in particular, the one that I'm interested in is impacts on expectation of privacy. And just, we run into that operating our UAS, is if there's more of them, is this going to change what expectation of privacy is? And how do you see that kind of playing out?
Yeah, I think we may all have comments on that, but I'll start off. Yes, there certainly is a concern around expectations of privacy. I think that it probably shows up more in the smaller drone space than it does in the larger aircraft space. So if we're talking about the aircraft that are large enough to carry people, whether they're carrying passengers or cargo, they're going to be flying higher at a higher altitude. So other than right in the immediate vicinity of where they're taking off and landing, I think the privacy concerns are less than some of the other environmental concerns like noise and visual pollution. Certainly with the smaller drones, privacy is much more of a consideration. But your point brings up, or your question brings up an interesting point. Certainly one of the things that we see a lot is that correlation between public benefit and tolerance for negative impacts. And I think this is a great example. Knowing that this aircraft is flying over my house, but they're doing mosquito control is different than this aircraft's flying over my house and delivering a burrito to my neighbor. So there really is an inverse proportion there.
Well, I mean, I agree with everything Yolanka said. There is a surprisingly growing volume of legislation at the state levels, looking at kind of drones and photography and regulating those types of privacy issues. So I would look into that. If you want afterwards, if you send me your email, I can kind of send you some resources that kind of talk about some of the state level laws. California even has a law of various sorts that cover that. I think more towards kind of Yolanka's point is that as this space starts to grow, and I'm gonna lump UAS and the larger aircraft into this for a moment here. I think we need to have a conversation about how we kind of prioritize the types of use cases that we want. That delivering a burrito is not the same use case as managing mosquito control. It's not the same use case as flying somebody to the airport. It's not the same use case as taking somebody to a hospital or delivering an organ. And so we need, I think, policy that really helps prioritize certain use cases and discourage the types of things that maybe we don't want. I mean, how many hamburgers is McDonald's up to now? Like 50 billion, or is it 100 billion? Like, we don't want 100 billion, drone deliveries of hamburgers or Big Macs. And so, and I'm not saying that would happen, but we might need to have a conversation around policy. No, I wasn't pointing at you. I'm looking in everybody's direction here on the panel.
Like one of those.
So, I think we need to have a conversation about policy. And I don't think at the state or federal levels we've had this conversation yet because it hasn't been needed. But I think it should be something we're proactive in.
Yeah, and it's a really difficult conversation to have because I think that conversation is needed. The challenge, really gets into access to the airspace, and the current rules that exist around, who has access to the airspace. So the FAA is really sensitive around equitable access to the airspace and use of the airspace. And so when you start getting into that direction of prioritizing, who has access over for certain use cases, I think I've seen the FAA kind of take a step back and says, well, we're not here to have that conversation. And so it's one of those things I think we need to keep bringing up because the more we bring it up, the more, I guess, it'll continue to push the need, for that level of a conversation. And, I see this in my home state right now in Utah, where we have 2 operators right now that are flying over within the metro region. Drone Up is serving, I believe, 2 different Walmarts in 2 different areas. They're flying within visual line of sight, within a mile, of the Walmarts that they're serving. The number one thing that they're delivering among both locations is cookies and cream ice cream. And then you have Zipline, who is doing medical deliveries, which again, a lot more people are accepting, of the Zipline medical deliveries because they know the social benefit that's coming from that. Whereas, again, if my neighbor is buzzing my house, interrupting, my movie, football game, whatever it be, because my neighbor wants cookies and cream ice cream, there's a certain level, there's a certain point to where that's not going to be tolerated anymore. And again, when we look at prioritizing the use of the airspace, that's a difficult conversation because that's, outside of local jurisdiction, that's outside of state jurisdiction. But when we look at how we use the land, I think that then becomes more of a local thing. So is this land going to be zoned for, is an allowable use of this land going to be for drone deliveries? And I think that's something, where maybe we can start having a conversation at the local level.
I'll just add to that. So one of the modules that we do in the cohort, the long course, is on the legal and regulatory framework and really understanding that the concept of federal preemption, that the FAA has control over the safety of the airspace. And I remember 4 or 5 years ago a conversation with a number of different people, and somebody saying, communities really don't understand how little say they have in all of this. And I just kind of went, wow. I don't think the aviation industry understands how much say communities actually do have in this. And that's that intersection of airspace, and certainly the FAA has the responsibility and authority to manage the national airspace. But communities, through land use and zoning, have a lot of say in what happens on the ground.
Well, and a little bit of background context in this. I mean, the federal government got out of the business of, regulating market controls with deregulation, in the industry. And I don't think anybody up here, I don't want to speak on anybody's behalf, but I don't think anybody of us would say we need to go back to kind of a highly regulated environment, from a market perspective. But I think there is a role for possible reasonable pricing here. That maybe there's a role of a fund where we pay into to help improve infrastructure as part of flights or improving flight plans, but also somebody who's going to fly a mile over a highly congested area, and they're going to have a pretty big environmental impact visually and noise and otherwise over a short distance, they're going to pay a lot more than somebody who's going to the hospital, in an air ambulance. And so I think we do need to, have a thoughtful conversation about how we advance policy in this area, because it's going to require new policy to enable us to do this. But there's no reason why somebody who is taking an ambulance to a hospital or an organ delivery should be on the same level of priority as delivering a hamburger or burrito. That's not equitable airspace in my view.
Josh.
Okay, this is on again. Yeah, so we have another question here for you.
So you answered some of the question that I was going to ask, but do you foresee, or are you engaging with political leaders to introduce language for some of these different levels of air mobility? So you're looking at, like say Amazon, are you anticipating any type of time limit on when the airspace can be used? Because, currently, people are getting Amazon packages during the day up until a certain time at night. Now with the access to air mobility with drones, that could be 24/7. And, I don't think anybody wants a package coming in at 3 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning, and, or are people getting burritos delivered at 2 o'clock in the morning after they get back from the bar?
So this is a conversation that really, I think, needs to occur. And I think there's both a spatial and a temporal component to this. So, you raise a valid point, time of day, but also somebody who lives in a very rural area, has a very different impact than being here in Monterey or Seaside, where it's highly populated, and you're operating a drone at any time of day, potentially. So, the short answer is these conversations really haven't happened yet, but I think we will get to a point where they will happen.
Yeah, and also, bringing this back to the realm of, where communities have, more jurisdictional authority on the land use side of it, there is some precedence, that we can look to with how heliports are managed today. Most heliports are managed locally through conditional use permits, and when they're permitted, oftentimes a condition that's assigned as a part of the permitting process is hours of operations. And so in that way, the local authorities aren't saying that you can't use this airspace during this window of time, because again, that is, federal jurisdiction. But they are saying that you cannot use access the surface, through aerial means from these hours to these hours. And then you look at the examples that I've looked at largely are in Los Angeles. Most of the heliports are permitted between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. They're only allowed about 3 operations a day to mitigate noise concerns, and so local authorities have, that kind of leverage, when going through that phase, and you can scale that down, down to the local level, even, at the point where if it's really contentious, each house could apply for a permit and say, I want drone delivery at my house, and then it's all right, well, we'll give you this permit, but these are the conditions we're going to assign to that based off of the feedback that we've received from the community.
Well, and that's where zoning control really comes to be important, because if you can build a vertiport by right, everybody's going to build a vertiport. But if you have to go and get a conditional use permit for one, all of a sudden, a jurisdiction can say, you know what, we're going to give you a permit for this, but as part of this, you've got to record on your deed that you're only going to operate between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m., for example. So there are a lot of land use tools that are out there that local jurisdictions have yet to really kind of, I think, utilize in this space.
So to kind of circle back to your question, I think, in terms of legislation, I think what we're seeing at the state level are some examples of either kind of broad language implementing legislation that says we're interested in advanced air mobility, we're going to fund a committee, a working committee, or so kind of broad first step implementation. We've also seen at the state level legislation that's very prescriptive. You can't build vertiports. I think we certainly saw that when it comes to small drones. We've seen communities say no drones. So the key here, again, is rather than that broad chopping block one way or the other, is to have a deeper understanding and be more specific around how we use these tools like zoning and conditional use permits.
And because this is DART, I'll put a little plug in on kind of the drone component here. I think the public has a really big, misperception about how drones can, and possibly should be used. This idea of kind of direct-to-consumer delivery with drones, that may not be the best way. And I think one of the most interesting things with Uber Elevate, with their demonstration, wasn't kind of transporting McDonald's, but it was this idea that it would go to a location, a staging area, where Uber Eats would make the last mile delivery. And so maybe there's a role for drones, but maybe it's not door to door or curb to curb.
Big advocate of that here.
So we need to have a conversation about things like drone ports. What are the first and last mile delivery options on the ground that kind of help maybe more effectively kind of manage the ecosystem?
Good discussion here. Thank you for that. We do have another question here, but just a thought that came to mind listening to this was, the idea, how do you all see the definition of advanced air mobility? Is it inclusive of small UAS all the way up to cargo and people moving?
Yes.
Okay, so that's all one arena according to your experience.
Yeah, I would say, so first of all, you're going to see different definitions if you go to different places. The definition that you saw in our early slides is the definition that CAMI has developed through the work that we've done. It's quite similar to, but not exactly to what FAA has said, because FAA is looking at this from an aviation and safety perspective and a certification and regulatory perspective. It's also not necessarily the same as what NASA has said. If you look at NASA's pillars of research, remembering that NASA is a federal research agency, they can also include things like hypersonic and supersonic. Those are also advanced aviation technologies. So for our purposes, because we're looking at this from a transportation system perspective, We do include small drones in that, but we recognize that that there are significant differences between the small drone category and these aircraft that are, as I say, large enough to carry people even if they're carrying cargo. And part of that difference is their genesis. The small drones have, that industry has grown from a hobby industry. And so you have a lot of private users of small drones. Advanced air mobility, while there are companies that are developing, aircraft for private or recreational use, the industry has grown mostly out of a vision of a commercial. And so there's an opportunity to be more proactive with the larger aircraft, and we've certainly seen reactivity when it comes to small drones.
I'm also in the camp that I think advanced air mobility does include drones. There are very definitions out there, and depending on the context, we may carve out what we're talking about, but fundamentally, I think it includes it. What I will say is, from somebody that does a lot of work also on the surface transportation side, I think we need more regulatory reform in how we think about these services. And the example that I would give you is take a look at like Uber, for example. You can, dispatch, food or delivery. You can schedule a ride to take you to the airport at 8 a.m., or you can book on demand. And if we were talking about kind of the way you apply that in the FAA context, each one of those use cases would be regulated very differently. And from the private sector perspective, that may not make a lot of sense. We may need, for example, regulations that allow for scheduled and on-demand services, and something that's more nimble. And so I think as we start kind of growing and scaling the industry, we need to start having kind of a thoughtful conversation about maybe we need to relook at how kind of the system regulating how it should be, not because of the way we've done it before.
Thank you. Andrea?
Hi, Andrea Pesci from UC Santa Cruz and also with DART. Thank you all. This has been really interesting for me. You've answered a lot behind my question, I think, already, but I guess, still some curiosity about this concept of like the priority use cases with respect to, community acceptance and engagement and so forth. And Adam, you mentioned that those conversations aren't being had yet. And I wonder sort of at what point in the sort of crawl, walk, run, stage should they be had? And is there any risk in sort of other parts of the infrastructure development getting ahead of that conversation that can sort of create sort of some negative outcomes that we don't want to see, perhaps, as a member of the community?
I think this is going to be a lengthy conversation. So, I would encourage, all the stakeholders to kind of start this conversation early, because I think it's going to take us a long time to get to a policy framework or a strategy. What I fear is that we're going to get into a scenario where we've got many more aircraft and users of different types in the airspace, and it's maybe first come, first serve, and maybe that's not the way it should be. In that priority use cases, or even the general population, might not benefit from that. So, if we don't want, for example, a single business traveler, flying in kind of an executive VTOL, delaying, 200 passengers on a flight out of SFO. And so like these are, I think, are the questions that we're gonna have to confront. I think it's easier to do it before that problem occurs versus being reactive.
Yeah, and I'll again, reemphasize, to the extent that we can have these communications at the local level, leveraging, the precedents that we have out there. Like I said, taking, what we do today for heliports, is a good starting point for how we understand, what precedent exists today to manage aviation within communities is a good starting point. And again, the fear that I have, is that we're going to get to 2025. We're going to have an aircraft, that's going to start flying. People are going to look up and go, "Oh, what's that?" And then that's when they're going to be, motivated to go talk to their elected officials to start these conversations. With that, it's already here. Now, what do we do to react to it? And I think that's similar to what we saw with previous iterations of transportation technology when Uber, launched in Los Angeles, and they tried to, get ahead of it, tried to regulate it, but by that time we're already preempted. Same thing happened with ride sharing, or not ride sharing, electric scooters in 2017. They just appeared on city streets, and put cities in a very reactive space. I think we have an opportunity right now with advanced air mobility where we can have, very fruitful conversations leading up to the deployment of this technology to at least get an idea of, what are the options out there. And so that's why I keep steering us back to the local level because, we've talked a little bit about, the challenges that exist at the federal level with trying to get ahead of this regulation. The federal machine is a very slow and deliberate moving, where it's slow and I guess maybe frustrating as it is sometimes at the local level, it's still quicker than what we can do at the federal level. And so let's, to the extent that we can, frame these conversations through the context of land use planning and zoning and transportation planning and figure out, what we can do with that to at least start these conversations and move it forward.
And I'll add kind of one more thing is that, the private sector should welcome this because a stable regulatory environment benefits everybody. It benefits users, it benefits non-users, it benefits the public, it benefits the folks that are investing in these new technologies. We should have an environment that works well for both business and the public sector and the public together.
Did you have a follow-on?
I would like to add to this as well that this is where I think that using a transportation system planning approach is really important. Understanding how this mode can benefit from a regional or metropolitan transportation system perspective is key to making sure that all of these pieces make sense. I also want to say that it continues to be an opportunity for the smaller GA airports to take a role in this and to reimagine themselves as valuable community assets for more than just GA pilots.
Yes.
Smaller airports can look at this opportunity to create electrical infrastructure and charging for both air and ground, to use their facilities for flight instruction, to create grid capacity, function as a microgrid, to function as a logistics and distribution center for their community. And I think that using that existing infrastructure makes sense from a public resource perspective and is a lot easier lift than starting to build new vertiports.
Yes. And I'll say, this is a conversation that we started in the state of Utah, back in 2017, and it takes time, to get that to that point. What we ran up against with the small GA airports is that the grant assurances that they've accepted on how the land's going to be used and managed around the airport was actually prohibiting, a more diverse, I guess, look at things. And so, that, forced them to go and have conversations, deeper conversations with their airport district office on, what was possible and what was the pathways to making that possible. And the next thing they ran up against was, the FAA was willing to have those conversations, but now because the small GA airport manager was also the public works director, he didn't have the bandwidth to facilitate those conversations, and so understanding the challenges that we have now, I'm a huge proponent of leveraging, the existing airport infrastructure, to enable this space. But there are challenges, in that, and that gets back to my earlier point. We have great ideas, but we got to start having these conversations. We got to start putting the ideas out there, and we got to start taking steps because every level that we advance this, we're going to come up against a new set of barriers that we have to navigate. And the sooner that we navigate those and push through them, the sooner we'll have lessons learned that we can propagate to the rest of the users. And so,
agreed.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all very much for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know there are other questions that come up. I mean, it's very topically relevant what was being discussed here, especially with some of our airport managers that are here. So you all are going to be here at least for the rest of the day, remainder of the day, and be circulating around. So there'll be opportunities for further conversation, and we encourage that. So thank you very much for the.
Would love to talk to everyone.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Josh.
Okay. Also, the topics on the policy was a great setup for our keynote speaker who will be coming on just after we get set into our lunch hour, Senator Caballero, who has led the creation of Senate Bill 800 here in California, which is setting up a committee to look at many of these topics that you were just talking about. So it was a great setup, so you don't want to miss that. Lunch will be starting to be served at 11:45. So that's intended to give people time to kind of get lunch in the room to the right of the foyer here if you walk out the door, and then kind of make your way back into here for the lunchtime address. And yeah, I mean, I just can't emphasize enough the spot on subject matter that we were able to talk about today, and I really appreciate everybody making the time to be here. And so with that, I think we can move into our pre-lunch mingle.